evening, everyone, and I want to welcome you to tonight's webinar of the Gerhard Center's webinar series, The Aftermath of the COVID-19 Crisis, the New Social Impact Ecosystem. I'm Helen Rizzo, and I'm an Associate Professor of Sociology at AUC. And it's my pleasure to welcome, and we're honored to have with us Professor Firth Murray, and she will talk about women's human rights. And the focus of tonight's talk will be on the following questions. Why focus on women? What is the general situation of international women's health and human rights? And she'll be talking to us about differences between women in resource poor countries and women in wealthier countries and regions. She'll be raising 4 critical issues: the demeaning and disempowerment of women, girls and women, the persistence of poverty, unequal access to education, food, health care, and money, and pervasive violence. She'll also be asking what is being done, and will give an overview of the increasing concern about women over the years. And she'll end on a hopeful note and talk about hopeful developments and changes. So to give a background on Firth Murray, she's a New Zealander. She studied economics and political science at the University of California and New York University. Over many years, she has worked as a writer and editor, an organizational leader, and a university professor. She founded the Global Fund for Women and ran it for 10 years, after which she taught on international women's health and human rights at Standford University. Her 2 published books are Paradigm Found, Leading and Managing for Positive Social Change, published in 2006, and From Outrage to Courage, The Unjust and Unhealthy Situation of Women in Poorer Countries and What They Are Doing About It. And the 2nd edition came out in 2013. Anne will have about 25 to 30 minutes to give her presentation, and then we will have discussion. The floor is yours, Anne.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. I seem to have a little congestion. Thank you so much to you and to the center and the American University in Cairo for inviting me today to come in and talk about women internationally. It's a huge topic, but we'll talk very much in overview terms, but I'm hoping that in the question and answer session, we can focus in on areas of interest to whoever is out there in the audience. And I'm not used to just talking to a face, but your face is fine to look at, Helen. But it's strange, not having an audience. Anyway, let me say that I've been teaching, as Helen said, for about 20 years at Stanford on the issues of women's health and human rights. People often ask me, how did you get interested in this topic? Where did it begin? And I think back, and I think my 2 answers. One answer is that when I was little, about 10 or 11 years old, my brother, who was a little older than me, had a paper route, and he made a little money delivering papers. And I said to my mother, I want to have a paper route. I want to earn money delivering papers. And my mother said to me, no, you can't do that. You're a girl. And I thought to myself, oh, yeah, that's right. I can't do that. But it was interesting because even thinking back now, if she had said you're too young or you're too this or that, that would have been different. But she said you're a girl. And I thought, yes, she's right. Therefore, I can't do it. But I didn't ever forget it. It seemed so unfair to me. And about 20 years after that experience, 15 or 20 years after that experience, I was working for a wonderful organization, actually a philanthropy, a foundation. And one day I received a phone call from someone in San Francisco. The organization is based in California, where I live. Call from someone in San Francisco who said, I'm doing a study of salaries in the philanthropic sector in the Bay Area and in California. And I'm just wondering, Anne, why you put up with being paid 20% less than the men on the staff of the foundation that you work for. And I said, well, I didn't even know that. So having learned that from this researcher, I went to the president of the foundation and I said, I've just learned this, that I'm being paid 20% less than the men on the staff. And I'm wondering why. I have excellent reports and all of that sort of thing, excellent evaluations and everything. And he said, first thing he said was, where did you learn about that? And I said, well, it was from this researcher who's working. And then he said, you're making a good salary for a woman. That was, and I've never forgotten that statement. Now, this was a long time ago. This was really quite a long time ago. Nowadays, I think we might have sued somebody, but in those days, there was no way that that was going to happen. But he did say that, you're making a good salary for a woman. And again, he was right. I was making a good salary for a woman. It was just that it was 20% less than what the men were making. So this, I think that experience, more than any other, led me really to think about moving to trying to get the foundation, incidentally, to start funding women's groups internationally. The foundation did work internationally, but they weren't interested in focusing on women or learning more about what was going on internationally with women. And but I became fanatically interested, actually, in the situation of women, discrepancies, misogyny, discrimination against women, particularly in the economic area. And I tried to learn more about it, and decided, in the company of a couple of friends over a couple of glasses of champagne one evening, that I was going to try to found a foundation, to create a foundation. And that was the thinking behind the Global Fund for Women, which still exists and is working in about 170 countries, I think, is now almost about 30 years old. This was back in 1987. No, sorry, not 87. It was about, I worked for the Hewlett Foundation in the 1970s, and yes, into 1980s. I ran the Global Fund for Women for 10 years, and then turned it over to good management and leadership, and began teaching at Stanford. So I began putting together the Global Fund at that time. The idea of the Global Fund was to be available to women's groups to support them in whatever they wanted to do. We learned from women's groups as we traveled and that sort of thing. At the beginning, I thought, can we raise the money? We didn't know how much money we wanted, but we knew it would be 3 or 4 million a year, surely, at least that. And we thought that it might be a problem raising that kind of money, because after all, we were creating the Global Fund because the foundation world was not supporting women. At that time, only one foundation had a program that had anything to do with women, and that was the Ford Foundation, that policy matters relating to women. But no other foundation focused on it. This was, as I say, back in the late 1970s, 80s. So we decided to create the Global Fund for Women, worrying about whether we could raise the money. Well, it turned out that we could raise the money. The question was then, were there appropriate women's groups around the world that we could in fact fund? Where were they? Would they find us? And we started working through our networks and telling people at various overseas organizations that we existed, and that we thought that we were focusing on women's rights, women's human rights, as an overarching interest. And secondly, we thought, not necessarily in order of importance, secondly, we thought that we would support on women's communications, networking and communication with each other. And as I talked to people working in the field, I mean, international groups and that kind of thing, people said, you really can't put together an organization that has anything to do with women if you're not willing to support economic issues, the discrepancy of women economically. I have to get a glass of water, I'm sorry. So we added economic equality or economic opportunity to our other two areas of interest. and started the Global Fund and found women writing to us from all over the place. So why women? I'm telling the story of the creation of the Global Fund. I might come back to it a little bit later, but why women? Because women are treated unequally in almost all countries of the world. Things are changing a little with regard to, for example, the issue of education, where more and more women do have access to education. In fact, more girls than boys go to school in Latin America and at the elementary level than in Latin America. More girls than boys outnumber them in school and in Latin America. In general, that issue of education, which has been really pushed centrally by the World Bank in its programs now on women, is, we might say, the primary intervention and the terribly important intervention if we're concerned about inequality among women. At the same time, and I think we might come back to this later, at the same time, educated women experience violence at about the same rate as poorer or uneducated women. That's about 1 in 3 women worldwide. Those numbers apply to the United States. That number applies to the United States. On average, 1 out of 3 women will experience violence, or some people call it domestic abuse. I call it violence against women in their lifetimes. 1 in 3. That's worldwide, as I said. South Africa is a little higher. Mexico's a little higher. United States is at that level. Japan is lower. But that's kind of an average, unfortunate statistic around the world. In terms of economics, differences in salaries, the 20% difference has closed a little in the United States. Women are making a little more money equally with men. It's still not equal for equal or like work. The best countries on that score are probably the Scandinavian countries. So there are these huge discrepancies. If we look at many different issues where women suffer ill health or injury or whatever, we see that right across the lifespan, there is this sort of sad discrimination against women, beginning even in childbirth, where larger numbers of female fetuses are eliminated. They don't even get to be born. Now that we can use amniocentesis and various technologies to find out the gender of the child, of the fetus. Childhood, problems of child labor, and even trafficking in young girls, especially as they grow into teen years. So we look at adolescence and we see that in those years of adolescence, there's still child labor. Boys, young boys, of course, also experience child labor, forced labor. Among girls, we see trafficking in women and girls in the teenage years primarily. Other problems in the teenage, HIV. And when I wrote my book about these subjects, the rate then among teenage girls, it was the fastest growing group contracting HIV. And I understand HIV and AIDS. I understand that's still true, that the adolescent girls are still very vulnerable to that, HIV and AIDS. Other issues affecting girls, particularly in teenage and young womanhood, of course, is early childbirth and early marriage. It's very widespread and apparently is increasing in some countries. And we wonder why, and let's come back to that in a minute. Early childbirth and early marriage, and therefore early childbirth. And then we move on through the other issues, violence against women. which I put at the center of any discussion on women's health. As I said, 1 out of 3 women worldwide will experience violence at the hands of intimate partners or family. I think violence, which is the strategy of people to maintain their place in a hierarchy or to move up in the hierarchy, people use violence. Nations use violence. We go to war. But violence against women, to my way of thinking, is central in so many ways. Primarily, it is, you know, if you have violence in the household, almost nothing else can happen. Just like when you're in the war, education systems break down, health systems break down. It's living in an environment where there's violence just limits everybody greatly. And it isolates women. When one of the ways that I might describe again later of what I think people can do is to come together in community, meet people, make friends, share your lives, feel strength with others. And that's very hard to do if you're living fairly isolated at home, which brings us to COVID. Rates of violence against women, where they are being collected and noted, and notably in this country, and primarily in Great Britain, rates of violence against women have risen over the past year. And they say because of COVID, because people are staying home, they feel crowded or unhappy in their isolation or in their crowded homes, and people lash out. So violence against women, I feel, as I say, just central, because it is this strategy that has to do with the hierarchies that we live in. And I was just looking at talking briefly about the span of a woman's life from childhood through adolescence to womanhood. The other huge issue, of course, as I say, I put violence at the center, but I think early marriage and early childhood, but then reproductive health in general, problems of illegal and unsafe abortion, reproductive health under unsafe conditions, another major health issue. Then we move on through the life cycle, but again affecting women primarily, is women refugees, women in war have special problems and are incredibly vulnerable. And finally, we come to the end of life. Well, I've noticed women in work, and I mentioned earlier the discrepancy economically, but we come to the end of life, aging, women and aging. Not much written about, but women live longer than men. Some people over time have argued that the reason for that is not necessarily that they're healthier, because they are very vulnerable through their lives, but they survive. Men tend to die from violence. Women tend to survive, but experience violence and illness, perhaps more than men, but they survive it. Why do they survive it? People have surmised that it's because we need older women to look after the younger generation, to look after children. The tremendous importance of grandmothers and sometimes grandfathers looking after that younger generation when parents need to earn money. So looking at the life cycle, we can see all of these problems, and it's kind of a sad story. I teach on the topic and I've written a book on it. And I often say to my students, look, let's not become miserable over this. What can we do? I mean, let's look at the good side of any of this. All of the issues that I've mentioned don't have necessarily a good side. Trafficking, violence, rape, unequal pay, they're all negatives, and they need to be addressed. But one of the things we learned when we put together the Global Fund for Women is that we weren't alone in the world. thinking about creating a women's group, people came to us and we learned that there were literally hundreds, if thousands, maybe even millions, but thousands of women's groups around the world, working in 165 countries or however many. Just huge numbers of women's groups coming together. Our experience was that they were 2 or 3 women, 4 or 5 women, writing to us sometimes. And, we tried at the Global Fund for Women to operate in any language. We were based in California and we had connections with the Monterey School of Languages. So we asked them if they'd translate if people wrote to us in any language that we couldn't easily use in our own staff. And we could, we had 3 or 4 languages we could work in, Spanish and French, and obviously in English. But they helped us out to translate. And these requests came in from all over the place of women who were joining together to just work on issues. I often said that in the 1980s and 90s, we could have been the Global Fund for Women Preventing Violence. It was the overwhelming issue that women wrote about. But we also had, of course, requests from women's groups working on training women to increase their economic situations, working on many, many other issues, trafficking and all the issues I've mentioned. I told everybody not to call me. I'm sorry. I should have turned that off. So anyway, we found finally, after thinking, are there any women's groups out there, that there were loads and loads of women's groups and more creating more communities everywhere. And all of this was boosted by the 1995 United Nations Conference on Women, which was a conference that happened in 1995 outside of Beijing in a place called Huairou. And one of the things we did at the Global Fund was support a lot of women to attend that conference. We had a lot of nice experiences about that. Many women's groups asked us to pay for their fare to go to Beijing, to be at that historic conference. There hadn't been, the previous conference had been 10 years before. And so here was this international conference, United Nations International Conference on Women in Beijing. The non-governmental part of that conference was held in Huairou. The formal governmental part of the conference was held in Beijing. And Huairou was a little muddy village outside of Beijing, but it thousands of women, I think it was something, I don't know, 100,000, 50,000 women went to Huairou for the non-governmental conference. And then there were the government representatives in Beijing. So we funded quite a few women to be able to go to the conference in Huairou. And I remember quite a few incidents like this, but there was a story, just this story, which I've always liked to think back on. And that is, in Argentina, there were 3 or 4 women's groups that wrote to us and asked if we would support women from their organizations to go. And we wrote back and said, look, we have limited funds, and could you get together and decide, we'll pay for 2. We'd like to try to encourage a younger woman along with the more experienced women in your groups. If you can do that, we can fund 2 to go to Beijing, but we can't fund 2 from every one of your groups. We don't have enough money to do that. So what happened in the case of Argentina and in a couple of other cases, they wrote back and said, okay, this has all worked out beautifully. We really didn't know each other until you asked us to get together and choose 2 women to go from Argentina. We've chosen 2 women from our 4 groups, and they're going to go and come back and report to us. And we've met friends and we feel excited about it. I mean, it was just so nice, you know, this tremendous generosity on the parts of women's groups and coming together to work together in this way. So that was very exciting. So anyway, in 1995, I mentioned that conference because quite a bit of research was done in the early 1990s on the situation of women in a number of different countries to present at that meeting. And that was the first time in a long time that really very good research was done. And what happened was that money was raised for people to do research. But after 1995, into the years 2000s, we have actually not no research, but very little research on the situation of women. Still, there's an increased interest in what's going on. And the 1995 conference pushed that interest up hugely. So a lot of more groups were created. Universities opened, you know, women's studies, international women's studies programs, and various, you know, various things happened as a result of 1995 and the UN conference. But there has been, I think very little research really, though we have learned quite a bit about how many women are being educated and so on. So we can make some generalizations and be fairly specific in the case of some issues. Okay, I'm going to wind down here because it's 25 minutes. And I think we can talk a little bit about the issues that I laid out or that Helen laid out, and turn it over back to Helen. I don't see her on my screen, however. Can someone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Maybe we've lost her because of the internet connection. So what I'm suggesting, why don't you tell us a little bit more about solutions? So how do we get out of this dilemma?
Okay.
Until Helen connects again with us.
Okay, Ali, I think I heard you, but you were cut off also.
No, I'm not, I can hear you. I can hear you very well. I'm saying maybe you could tell us a little bit more about.
Yes, I heard.
How do we solve the problem?
How do we solve a problem? Well, in a sentence, after a sip of water, we all become much nicer people, treating each other better. But let me say that the huge development and sophistication, increasing sophistication of women's groups, I think is one hopeful sign. There are, as I said, hundreds, thousands of groups around the world, and you know, I could. They range from networks of lawyers across Africa to a group that I was in touch with just this last week, a group of teenage young women from 16 to about 25, who've come together to empower each other and particularly look at the use of technology by young women. And we're seeing many groups developing around women's need and access to modern communications technology. I think those are all very, very hopeful signs, and especially younger women moving into these positions. We're also seeing, of course, women taking leadership. I mean, the statistics aren't wonderful about that. We have about 180 countries, I think, actually in the world. Am I right? Maybe you know, I should have the exact number, but I think it's 180 countries, I think. And 23 of those countries have women heads of state. Well, that isn't very high percentage given the world, but it's a high percentage given how few countries had women as heads of state, even 10 years ago. I mean, this is a big change. 23 heads of state and lots of other women in positions like vice president, or we have here in the United States, or women coming up through the networks and through their governmental positions and so on, so that we'll have much greater leadership. We're seeing more women leaders in the corporate world. I mean, it's not huge, but it's much more than it was. So I think women are taking leadership all around the world. And I think, so there are good things. That's the good news. The question, the bad news is that some of these practices are still persisting. Violence against women is the one that I've mentioned. It goes on at high rates in every country in the world. But issues like trafficking, it's decline, trafficking in women, oh my God, trafficking in women and girls. I'm sorry, I'm really sorry about this. I'm on a call. Trafficking in women and girls, unequal access to education. In a few areas, women we're seeing very hopeful signs, I think. But then we go on. What about women's access to money? Well, we know there's unequal pay. And we know that people who lose their jobs, the first people who start losing their jobs in times like now, are women. Many more women than men have lost their jobs during this pandemic. So we have that continuing inequality in terms of economics, continuing inequality in terms of access to food and healthcare. So what I don't want to keep perpetuating a sad day here, but it is looking at women's health and human rights can bring you down, can make you feel a little sad. So because I didn't want to be dragged down in this way, and yet I wanted to continue to teach my classes at Stanford on international women's health and human rights, I decided to take some time to look at the opposite of violence. And Gandhi considered the opposite of violence to be love. And I ended up, long story short, I won't even talk about that too much, but I ended up teaching and have been teaching for the last 5 years or so at Stanford, a class on love as a force for social justice. And if you want, I can talk a little bit about that later, but it's slightly off topic here. So let me turn this to Helen. Sorry, you disappeared for a little bit, but yeah, now you're back.
Yeah, I apologize. The internet went out, but thankfully it came back. But thank you very much for your talk. Actually, in terms of, I guess I'll take the prerogative as the moderator to ask the first question. I actually would like to hear more about your class on love and what you talk about and how do you relate it to gender.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Quickly, because it isn't. Well, it is. Of course, it emerged from my serious concern about violence. And I decided one day, walking across the campus at Stanford, that I mustn't be dragged down by talking about all these miserable things and violence. We have to look at the positive interventions and positive things. So as I said, I decided to start reading a little bit about love. And I learned that, as I mentioned, Gandhi didn't equate, he saw the opposite of violence as love, or I read that somewhere in Gandhi's writing. And I began to read about peace and love and that sort of thing. And as I read, I thought I could put together a class. So that's what I did. Now, we talk about the meaning of love, and in my class, we talk about love being a kind of basis or essence or center in most religious traditions. What do we mean by it? And there are people put forth various definitions. The best one I've come across, and the one that I keep coming back to, makes me sound perhaps very touchy-feely or something, but it is a kind of definition of love that Thich Nhat Hanh, who is a Buddhist monk, put out. He probably, I mean, he's written a whole, maybe he's written the books, maybe other people have written them with him, but anyway, it's in one of his books on love. But he describes love in terms of 4 mantras. And those mantras are as follows. Dear one, I am here for you. Now that I like a lot because it equalizes the conversation immediately. If you say to somebody, dear one, I am here for you. The second mantra is, dear one, I see you and it makes me happy. The third mantra, dear one, I see that you are in pain and that is why I am here for you. And the fourth mantra is, dear one, I am in pain. Please help me. And I read those and I just think they're profound because it sort of covers the whole thing. It covers being there for somebody. It covers having compassion when people have pain. It covers your own need to be vulnerable, to be willing to be vulnerable when you need love or you need help. I am in pain, please help me. So, maybe I'll just end there. That by saying that the Thich Nhat Hanh's 4 mantras just sum it up for me. And I try to pass on writing and thoughts and philosophy about love to my students, and we read what we want to. And these are small classes, usually about 10 students, and they were taught at Stanford, have been taught at Stanford under the freshman and sophomore programs, so that they are classes that are taught specifically to freshmen and sophomores. We've lost, I have anyway, lost Helen again.
No worries, just go on.
Well, so that was really, she asked me more about my class on love, and that's really about it. I'm not teaching at the moment. I think I've retired from Stanford. I haven't really decided yet, but I have 2 classes online, I should mention, so people can look at them. One of them is on international women's health and human rights, and the other is on love as a force for social justice. Both of those are online on Coursera. So Coursera is the platform that puts academic classes online. So just to repeat it, because Helen has just come back, both my classes, International Women's Health and Human Rights and Love as a Force for Social Justice, are online on Coursera. And the International Women's Health and Human Rights is also online on the Standford platform. So people wanting to take the classes, or they can go to Coursera, or for the International Women's Health class, they can, and Human Rights class, they can go to online Stanford.
Okay, sorry again for leaving all of you. But I do have a question on the chat. Actually, let me see, that I think one of my students, I would like to ask him if he would like to unmute himself, or I think I can ask him to unmute.
Yes,
Ahmed, yeah, hi Ahmed, would you like to ask your question? It's very good.
Yes, I wanted to ask why, there are many efforts that have been made by the United Nations regarding the situation of women, but there have been many conventions, such as the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the BPFA, but why aren't these the many efforts that are made and those many lists are not that effective? We're not seeing them being made effectively, or even taken into consideration.
Sorry. No. I should probably have mentioned them, especially the Convention on the, what's the whole long phrase? The Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. I don't know if they are not effective. I mean, you've said that they're not effective. they may not be effective. They may be effective. They may be partially effective. I mean, they're very, very important that the UN has finally taken up these issues. And even some of these things didn't even appear on the agenda of the United Nations until the 1990s. And that's, that's amazing. But there's a lot of activity now, a lot of activity at all levels and in, I think, in many organizations to be concerned about women, to change women's situation, to bring women into equality. But, and I don't mean to make excuses for people who don't do this thoroughly and jump right into it, but it is hard. It's very hard to change. If you think of the actual realities and traditions of the positions of women, the roles of women, it's extremely hard to make change. But I'm not sure that the conventions that you refer to are not effective. They may have, they may be we wish that they are more effective than they are. But I don't know how effective they are. Do you, Ahmed? I guess he's there. I know he's there. I see his name.
Yeah, because I've been working in MUN for a very long time. Like I don't think they're effective like globally. They might be effective in some regions and in some like in some regions and some countries, but I don't think they're globally effective. And it's certainly
Absolutely.
with some, and certainly when we're talking about all groups of women, like I think they might be effective to other groups than other groups. They might be effective, like maybe for they might be less effective to marginalized women.
Yes.
That's my point.
Yeah, and yes, of course, things differ from country to country because the UN and people supporting the efforts that are laid out in the conventions can't do anything without the collaboration of governments. And we have countries in which governments have not moved forward with increasing the status of women. So it's a slow thing, but it's happening. I do think that there are changes, and unfortunately I think COVID especially, and anything that a pandemic and a crisis like that globally, on the one hand it shows us how linked we are internationally, how connected we are, but on the other hand it isolates people and individual people, and has really had an effect on rather badly on women, who have also become ill at higher rates than men. Oh, Helen.
Oh, yeah, I'm back. Yeah. I was just, I thought I was gonna go out again, but no, I'm still here. And yeah, thank you, Ahmed, for your question. And also, I think Pakinem has a very interesting question. So I'd like to invite her to ask her question. And if you can turn on your camera. Is she still here? Pakinem? Let me see. Her question, I think, was, let's see, most of the current initiatives are focusing on women's empowerment. And so from your perspective, isn't it important to empower men in order to empower women? And what kind of initiatives, interventions targeting men do you suggest?
Okay, empowerment. Yes, the quick answer is. I think people who are in the field felt it's terribly important to work with women, to make them empowered, to empower them. What is empowerment? Okay, I'm going to tell you what I think empowerment is, and then we can get back to the question of men, which I also think is very important. But anyway, what do I mean by empowerment? I mean having a vision for change, creating a plan of goals to move toward that vision. And the third part of empowerment, very important, is feeling that you can take the first steps to meet those goals, to work toward your vision. So you have a clarity of vision, you have goals leading toward that vision, and then you feel that you have the capacity to take the first steps toward those goals. It could be learning to drive, it could be going to university, it could be learning a language. You know, what do you need to do to, or it may be going to high school or going to elementary school. You have a broad goal out there somewhere, and you have a plan to get to it, and you want to see, can you take the first steps toward the plan? Okay, that's what I think empowerment is. So if we can do, and there are organizations around the world working on the issue of empowerment. There's one that I'm associated with that is, that works on teaching girls how to avoid violence. It's called No Means No Worldwide. No Means No Worldwide. It works mostly in Africa, in 2 or 3 countries in Africa with local partners in Africa. And they have a system of attempting to teach people to themselves, teach other people how to avoid, prevent violence. Okay, now let's get to men and boys. That organization and others also has a curriculum that works where they work with boys and men, young men. Usually, I think it's between the ages of about 12 and upwards. And they do have a curriculum for this. So they are working with men. The question you asked, though, is it important to work with men? Absolutely, we have to. Not that men are the only people who perpetrate violence, but you know that we do think that often men do against women, because women are overwhelmingly the victims. I don't want to say victims, the survivors of violence. So we need to work with women, but yes, we do need to work with men, probably to empower them to be able to be equal with women, not to lose their power, but to understand that women being equal is not a threat to them. So it's not an easy task to change the cultures almost everywhere that say that not only are men stronger than women, because that's often simply true, they're physically stronger than women, but they're smarter, they're better, they deserve more, all of that is so deep in our cultures, so difficult to change. How can we change? We begin to get to know other people who are different from ourselves. Women, men, women coming together in communities, men and women meeting each other, maybe going to school together, getting to know each other, learning that they can be equal, and hopefully that it is a good thing. I think this is an extremely challenging area, but I hope I've sort of responded to some degree. It's a very important question, and it's a very hard one to answer.
Okay, thank you, Anne, for your answer. I think the next question is from Norhan. I'll try to ask you to unmute if you'd like to ask your question directly. Maybe it's not working.
I don't see anything in the chat, but
I'm getting messages in the chat, and I was able to unmute Ahmed, but I guess I can't unmute anyone else. So the question that she is asking is, what do you think about women's issues not being addressed in underdeveloped countries because the lack of awareness or maturity about women's rights, and how can we work through that with the complications of religious and cultural norms?
Yeah. Um, yes, it's not just in lower income countries where women are discriminated against and where women have problems. I do want to mention that. However, the problem is probably more difficult in lower income countries where communications maybe not as available to people. People aren't able to be educated as, you know, many more women than men are illiterate and have not had access to any education beyond even the beginning of elementary school. So we have places how do people learn how to change their lives? Where do they go? How do they learn? Um, so again, education is probably the one intervention that people would speak about. I think that I come back to the importance of community, maybe even small groups. The the creation of little women's groups, sometimes getting bigger and bigger, some they grow, but many of the groups that we were in touch with when I was with the Global Fund for Women were small. There were 5 people, maybe there were 7 people, but maybe there were 3 people. But they wanted to get together and they had a goal, they had a vision, they had a plan. Their plan was to meet, get together, create a little club of some sort, and meet regularly, and maybe learn how to read together, or make crafts together, or do something toward that vision. So I feel strongly about the importance of people creating community, even if it's a small group of people. It can be a very strong um, uh, uh, um, force for change, I feel. Now, again, I'm not sure I answered uh, that question well enough, but I hope I did.
Thank you, Anne. Let me see. We have a question from Nahla, and maybe I will try again to see if I can, but I no longer see Nahla. Um, but um, but I will ask her a question because it's related to healthcare, which I know is one of your areas of expertise. So she was asking, books published in the past few years, such as Invisible Women and Doing Harm, have highlighted issues of inequality in healthcare, car safety, urban design, and many other issues. And she wanted to know your take on those issues and if there are any organizations working to fix them.
Repeat those issues that she laid out.
So the issues of healthcare, car safety, urban design, and if you knew of any organizations or your take on those kinds of issues, and are there organizations working to fix them?
Wow. You know, I can't believe that there are not organizations that are looking at, and I assume that you're looking at women's health in the context of these things: design, urban design, care, car safety, and the various things. It, um, I'm stumped. I don't know of organizations working on those issues specifically, but they have to exist. I think women are organizing all over the place in many countries on many issues. So I would urge you, and when we finish this program, I'm going to go to Google and see what I can find on those issues and women's organization around them. But I'm not familiar with any groups that are working on those issues.
Okay, I have the same feeling as you that there must be women working on these issues, but I can't think of any off the top of my head.
I think so, yeah.
But well, I do have a question here that is more related to the Middle East, but the person who I don't think she's no longer here in the audience, but I think it's still important to ask that she wanted to know, in order to understand a problem, we need data. And a major problem in the Middle East, North Africa region is the presence of research gaps and the status of women's rights. How would you envision solving this problem?
Well, I think that's a problem everywhere, actually. I think, as I mentioned, there was a lot of research that was done in preparation for the 1995 conference on women, United Nations Conference on Women. And a lot of the case studies and research studies that we even now look at and even quote from come from 1995, because there's so little research, not just in Middle East countries, you were asking fairly specifically about that, but in many countries. So how to solve it? I don't know what you're doing if you're the person who posed this question, but I have to say, if you're a researcher, if you're a university student, or if you're a high school student wanting to go to university and heading for, start training in this sort of research. We need people who are listening today to learn more about the situation of women and collect data that can be used for policy and actual change and policy change, pretty much in every country. It's as I said, the research has not been widespread. We do have more than existed in 1995, but you know, there really has not. We don't know enough often to force or inform policy change. There are international research organizations. I'm trying to think of the International Center for Research on Women is based in the United States. I think it's in New York now, it might be in Washington, but I think it's in New York. And there are, of course, other research centers on women in universities here and there. There are several here in the United States. So if you're actually specifically interested in these questions, you might want to, again, Google those places and write to them and find out what kind of research is going on.
Let's see. Another question from Ahmed was, do you think that women who face violence are given the proper tools and methods to try and surpass this phase in their lives?
No, because we're not sure of the tools in any case. I mentioned an organization that I'm associated with called No Means No Worldwide, and they are in the business of training people to be trainers, to help women learn how to avoid violence. And one of the main I guess methods is to empower those women. Now, what do we mean by that? I mentioned empowerment. Somehow teach or encourage, urge, help, support those women, all women, maybe those women, to have a vision for change, to want to change, to want to somehow change. Develop a plan. Maybe that person needs help in developing a plan. Maybe that person needs to divorce her husband. Maybe that, you know, who knows? Maybe that person needs to have other people on her behalf talk to her husband if he is the perpetrator of the violence. I guess I've lost the train of the actual question, but I think there are organizations that are kind of trying to teach these things. They have been successful. The levels of violence have apparently been reduced in places where these programs have been established, but it's not widespread. The research is limited, but it seems to be effective. Empowerment.
Well, I guess I want to take my prerogative again as the moderator, and a follow-up question on about violence against women, and coming back to the issue of men and masculinity. And are any of these groups that you're familiar with, are they trying to change notions of masculinity or what it means to be a good man, and trying to separate violence as the only, I guess, appropriate response men are going to have to some issues. And so I was wondering your views on this.
Yes. Yes, there are organizations working on this. And just personally, I have to say, we're seeing more and more articles on these topics. People are writing about this question of masculinity, not necessarily in the context of violence against women, but it's useful because very useful in the context of violence against women to see people researching and writing about what we mean by being masculine. Are the cultural norms changing, and that sort of thing. I think I'm impressed by how much I've seen just in reading the New York Times and New Yorker and various things, people writing on this very topic. As I say, not in the context necessarily of violence against women, but the topic of masculinity and what we mean by a good man and a healthy man and a good man and a strong man and so on. Yeah, so I think the topic, there's interest out there, I think, just in terms of just looking at what do we mean by masculinity and femininity or whatever. But there's also interest, that's maybe almost separate or in a line. There's also tremendous interest in trying to reduce the incidence of violence against women and children. Yeah.
Yeah, and trying to tackle that, men often being the perpetrators.
Yeah.
Do we need to start addressing that in order to start reducing?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Yes, there's a lot of interest, and in the very basic question of how we solve problems, how we address issues. I mean, when I was little, and I'm sure it happens now, I was probably a pretty good child. However, if I was naughty, I might get a little smack on my bottom, and I grew up in those days when people were spanked. You're going to get a spanking, that kind of thing. My father never laid hands on him. My mother was sort of quite a disciplinarian, but she almost never. I can think of maybe one occasion or two occasions when I got a smack on my bottom. But people spanked their children, and it was common and accepted to kind of react to bad behavior with violence. And I think there's been a lot of talk about trying to change that norm, and I think it has changed. I think it got kind of out of hand to some degree with people, and even in schools. I went to school where they strapped kids. Bad kids were taken off by the these were public schools, but this was a long time ago. And somebody would be naughty or be very bad to break the rules of some sort, and they would go to the principal's office and get strapped on their hands, and it hurts. It's terrible. And that was just par for the course. I mean, they didn't sue the school. They went home and hoped that the school didn't tell their parents that they had been bad.
Yeah, I mean, thankfully that has dramatically changed in many places. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's changed a lot. And that is just the simple point that we don't solve violence with violence, or we don't solve bad things or something with violence. We have to move to kindness, compassion, love, support, help, whatever.
Yeah, exactly. I think on that note, since I think our time has ended with you, Anne, it's been a pleasure to have you with us, and for all of your insightful comments and your talk. And I would like to thank the audience for your participation in this webinar, and hopefully we will see many of you next week. Just to give a few quick announcements about the next webinars. On Monday, March 8th, the topic will be A Republic of Equals, a Manifesto for a Just Society by Jonathan Rothwell, Principal Economist at Gallup. And then on Wednesday, March 10th, the talk will be about decent jobs in the future of work after COVID-19 by Sarita Gupta, Director of Future of Workers Program from the Ford Foundation. So I thank all of you. Thank Anne again.
Monday.
Thank our audience. Yeah. Oh, Anne, yes.
Helen, I want to say thank you very, very much. And to remind you that next Monday is International Women's
Oh, that is
Day.
a very
And so
important
it's very
announcement.
logical. So Monday is International Women's Day, but sorry to interrupt you, but I did want to thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you very much.
It's great to have you here. Thank you so much. And yes, remember next week is Monday is International Women's Day, everybody. So have a good evening. It was great to have you all here with us tonight.
Bye.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Helen. It's been very, very eye-opening.
Thank you for
Thank you.
inviting me.
Yeah, thank you, Ali, for organizing tonight's talk and your whole series.
Thank you, Helen. Thanks. And thanks for moderating.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye, Anne.
Thank you.
Bye. Nice to meet you, Anne.
Bye. Same to you.